Back in 2018, when we had Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and the PS4 game, and we were all still excited about Spider-Man joining the MCU, I remember seeing the same kind of sentiment over and over again on social media, and that was, there has never been a better time to be a Spider-Man fan. And I don't want to take away from that at all. Undeniably, Spider-Man fans were eating well, as we used to say in the good old days of comic book Twitter. But I do remember thinking then, as I still do now, that nothing will ever compare to the period between 1994 and 2002. Now, obviously, I'm biased because that's the period of time I grew up in. That is my Spider-Man. But even setting the nostalgia goggles to the side, this was when Spider-Man went from being one of the most popular comic book characters to one of the most popular TV shows, video games, movies, and just everything in between. So in this video, I want to talk about that time, growing up as a Spider-Man fan, and kind of touch on some of my experiences at the time, what was exciting about it, and why I still love this era for Spider-Man now. And one of the things I want to highlight is the contrast between what was happening with Spider-Man in movies and in TV shows, and what was happening in the comics, because this is arguably Spider-Man's darkest period in comics. And I don't just mean tonally dark, although that is true, but this was a period of time in which a lot of comic book fans turned their backs on the wall crawler. Hey heroes, I'm Josh from Panels to Pixels, and this is when Spider-Man could not miss. Except in the comics. So let's set the scene here. It's 1994 and the comic speculation bubble has peaked and it's about to go way down. We're about to hit an absolute market crash. A lot of comic book shops are about to go out of business. Marvel themselves are going to have to declare bankruptcy in a couple of years. And as profits fall at Marvel, we're going to start to see declining standards in the comics themselves. In a lot of cases, that is, but not all. You know, there's still a lot of great comics from this era. I always like to point that out. But particularly in Spider-Man, you start to see some questionable editorial choices being made. There are these sprawling events which run across multiple titles just to squeeze every last penny out of collectors and readers. And these events start to have diminishing returns by 1994. And this all culminates that year with the infamous Clone Saga. This was a storyline that was dragged out over 70 plus issues to maximize sales, but it ultimately just alienated readers and fans. So all of this is to say that Spider-Man comics were not in a good place in 1994, when a brand new animated series featuring the Wallcrawler would debut on the Fox Kids network. This show was my first introduction to the world of Spider-Man, and if you're watching this and you're in your 30s, it was probably your first introduction to Spider-Man as well. Following in the footsteps of 1992's Batman the Animated Series and X-Men, Spider-Man took the darker tone and kind of moody gothic aesthetic of Batman the Animated Series, and then the whip-fast pacing and social issues of X-Men, and then combined it all into a delicious Spider-Man stew. And if you didn't grow up with this cartoon, you might not necessarily see what's so special about it. I know people who maybe grew up with Spectacular Spider-Man and later shows go back to this one and think it's just a load of corny, hammy nonsense. But something you've got to remember is that before this, we had stuff like the 80s Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, or even the 60s show, and both of those certainly have their charm, but they weren't really exciting us as comic book fans. They weren't giving a lot of reverence to the source material. The 90s cartoon's head writer, John Semper Jr., was himself a comics fan. He'd grown up reading Spider-Man comics, and it's from a lot of those 70s comics that he pulls some of these really weird storylines that aren't necessarily, the bona fide classics. That's why you end up with season-long story arcs about Morbius the Living Vampire, and Man-Spider, and the whole Neogenic Nightmare storyline. But John Semper Jr. did directly adapt some classic Spider-Man storylines from the comics, and he even brought in some veteran comic book writers to work on the show, such as Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, and Jerry Conway. This all added to the sense of authenticity, and like X-Men, it would be a great primer for me to jump right into the comics. This is the show that converted me into a lifelong comics fan. In the past, whenever I've talked about these 90s cartoons, I always like to point out how they embrace the supernatural horror elements of superheroes, whereas modern adaptations trend towards technology and sci-fi, I guess in an attempt to ground these stories in reality. But screw reality, man. I want to see Clayface as this big, gooey mudman, or the Rhino as a guy with a rhino skin grafted onto his skin. That's way cooler, right? I mean, ultimately, it just comes down to an aesthetic choice. It's not affecting the emotional core of the story, but as a big horror kid, it was a huge part of the appeal for me. And of course, we've got to talk about Christopher Daniel Barnes, who is still the quintessential voice for Peter Parker, in my opinion. I just love how he captured the hopeful optimism of Spider-Man, but he could also do the overwrought melodrama. And I really love how this show incorporates the thought bubbles and inner monologues of the comics to have Peter soliloquizing as he swings around the city. Spider-Man, the animated series, as it's sometimes known, fulfilled its 65-episode order, running for 5 seasons between 1994 and 1998, making it one of the longest-running Marvel cartoons of all time, although it's since been surpassed by things like Ultimate Spider-Man and Avengers Assemble and Guardians of the Galaxy? I haven't seen that show, but I can't believe how many episodes that's had. Now, it would be remiss of me here not to mention 1999's Spider-Man Unlimited, which was a kind of, sort of, maybe spiritual spin-off from the 94 show, which saw Peter Parker donning a new futuristic suit and travelling to Counter-Earth, a dystopian cyberpunk world reigned over by the High Evolutionary. And this one is arguably a miss, but as it's not a straight-up adaptation of Spider-Man, and more importantly because it contradicts the thesis of this video, I'm choosing not to include it. And, there's nothing you can do about it. Back in the comics though, and after a few years of declining sales, declining enthusiasm, and more outlandish storylines, Marvel decided to clean house by relaunching the Amazing Spider-Man series with a new issue 1 in 1999. Now, this happens all the time nowadays, but back then, The Amazing Spider-Man had been running since 1963, so this was a pretty big deal. And in fact, it was around this time that I started buying comics regularly. Issue 22 here was my first regular issue of the title, and just look at that cover. But despite some great artwork by John Romita Jr., this relaunch did little to reinvigorate the character. It was a lot of the same creative teams working on the title that were on it before the relaunch, and it was just a case of business as usual with a new number on the cover. The shot in the arm that Marvel had hoped for would arrive the following year in 2000 with Ultimate Spider-Man. Writer Brian Michael Bendis and artist Mark Bagley set out to create a true, modernised reimagination of the character, with an all-new continuity. They took Peter Parker back to being a teenager at Midtown High and retold that classic origin, which was originally only 11 pages long in the 60s, but Bendis fleshed it out across 7 issues. And whether you think that kind of decompression is a good thing, or the death knell of superhero comics, I have kind of mixed feelings about that myself, but I would argue that the first Sam Raimi movie does not happen without this comic. Or at least, it would have been a very different movie. We'll talk about that film more in a minute, but I think people like to point out all of the Steve Ditko-isms and the 60s stuff and the kind of campy classic Spider-Man elements. And all of that stuff is in there and working symbiotically with Sam Raimi's style, but Ultimate Spider-Man was a testbed for how Spidey's origin would work on the big screen. There is as much of this in that film as anything else. Quick story time, and you can skip ahead if this becomes too self-indulgent, but I had Ultimate Spider-Man issue 1 as a kid, but unfortunately this is not my childhood copy. And the reason for that is that I just picked it up thinking, oh, it's a new Spider-Man comic, and it was only after I kind of read it and understood it that it was like, this is not the 616 continuity that I know and love. Even as like a, 8, 9-year-old, I was a comic snob. And so I rejected the Ultimate Universe for a long time. In fact, it's only in the kind of post-MCU world that I've started to appreciate what the Ultimate Universe did in kind of laying the groundwork for Marvel's cinematic success. So I traded my issue 1. This is probably my biggest comics regret. I traded it away for a box of Warhammer that I don't think I ever even painted. So there goes my Ultimate Spider-Man issue 1. Fortunately, it's not a terribly expensive comic, but I would have liked to have had my childhood copy. Alright, thanks for indulging me there. In 2000 also saw the release of Neversoft's Spider-Man for the PlayStation, with later versions for the N64, Dreamcast, and the PC. I've talked about this game loads of times, going all the way back to the beginning of Panels to Pixels, and no doubt I will talk about this game many other times in the future, because it was completely instrumental to my lifelong Spider-Man fandom. Aesthetically, it shares a lot with the 90s cartoon, and you could be forgiven for thinking that it is a video game adaptation of the cartoon. But it borrows much of its continuity from the comics, along with characters and a huge range of unlockable costumes, which wasn't really a thing in Spider-Man games before then, but it's now like a staple. It's one of the main draws for Spider-Man games. It was really the complete Spider-Man experience, and I'm trying not to sound like too much of a boomer here, but again, if you didn't grow up with this, you might not see the significance now, looking back. I'd understand for younger people, there's no open world, no free camera, it's kind of got those dodgy PlayStation 1 controls, but you have to remember that this was the first 3D Spider-Man game. This was the first time I got to exist in the Marvel Universe version of New York City and really feel like I was exploring that world. To swing past the Four Freedoms Plaza on my way to meet the Human Torch atop the Statue of Liberty, it was really exciting. I'll be talking about this more in an upcoming video about life before the Marvel movies, but in a pre-MCU world, I really can't overstate how magical it was to kind of see Spider-Man in the third dimension. And as the back of the box proclaimed, you don't just play it, you live it. And a licensed game getting this much care and attention was virtually unheard of back in the PlayStation 1 days. Never mind a superhero title. And like many of the best 3D games on the PS1, your Tomb Raiders, your Silent Hills, Neversoft took the limitations of the console and built it into the story and the gameplay and even the look of this Spider-Man game. The sea of pea green fog not only provided a plausible explanation for why you can't just descend to the streets and explore New York City by foot, but it also adds to the bright, colourful comic book aesthetic. It's just such a vibe, man. I love the way this game looks. But hey, to give you a full picture of being a Spider-Man fan at the turn of the millennium, I have to talk about this guy. This is the Toy Biz Spider-Man Classics Series 1 Spider-Man from the year 2001. And this was my favourite Spider-Man figure as a kid. It's one of the only toys that has survived from my childhood collection. And it's still one of my favourites now, 24 years later. Oh my god, I'm old. Toy Biz made some great Spider-Man figures before this one, particularly with the line based on the cartoon. But this guy came along and just made all of my other Spider-Mans obsolete. He towered over them, he had all of this great sculpted and painted detail. He had that kind of Mark Bagley stroke, kind of Todd McFarlane look. I just took this thing everywhere I went. And at some point, I want to make a more in-depth video on how this figure changed the course of action figure history. However, I'll probably do that on my brand new toy channel, Panels to Plastic. Shameless plug! But suffice to say, without this figure, there is no Marvel Legends, there's no 6-inch standard in action figures, and there's just no modern toy collecting as we know it. Anyway, how are those comics coming along? Well, Ultimate Spider-Man had proven that the webhead could still be relevant in the 21st century and could still be a draw for new readers. But how about original recipe, main continuity, good old-fashioned amazing Spider-Man? The new issue 1 relaunch hadn't really excited readers the way that Marvel hoped it would, but starting from issue number 30, cover dated June 2001, artist John Romita Jr. was joined by TV writer J. Michael Straczynski. And this run is now remembered as the definitive modern Spider-Man run. It completely turned the title's reputation around, with more ambitious storytelling and greater emotional stakes. It put Peter Parker back in a familiar setting by making him a high school teacher, while pushing the character in bold new directions with the introduction of the Spider Totems and the perhaps contentious idea that Peter was chosen to become Spider-Man. It was his destiny. And so finally, after a decade on the ropes, Spider-Man comics were back on top again. For now. Which brings us to 2002. There had been rumblings of a big-budget Spider-Man movie my entire childhood. James Cameron was attached to direct for a long time, with Leonardo DiCaprio considered for the role of Peter Parker/Spider-Man. But I wasn't privy to any of those details as a kid, and besides, my only point of reference for what a Spider-Man movie could look like was episodes of the 1977 Spider-Man TV series that were re-edited and packaged together as movies and released in the UK. 1978's Spider-Man Strikes Back and 1981's Spider-Man The Dragon's Challenge. And I had both of these movies on video, and I used to watch them religiously, even though they were a bit rubbish. So imagine my surprise when, in 2002, Sam Raimi turns around and pulls out this absolute whopper of a movie. Oh my goodness, the performances by Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker, Willem Dafoe as Norman Osborn, that Danny Elfman score, the explosive action, the peachy, sunset-soaked version of New York that is just so comic booky and yet so real and tangible. And you also get some of that supernatural horror thing that I was talking about in the cartoon, courtesy of Sam Raimi and his background with the Evil Dead trilogy. To be honest though, the one thing that I didn't love at the time was the costumes, and it's funny to me now how beloved these costumes have become, particularly when the Spider-Man PS4 game came out. There was that big campaign to get that Sam Raimi suit in the game, and at the time I was like, wow, this is crazy, because I actually didn't like that suit when the film came out. As a kid, these costumes seemed too modern. They seemed like too much of a departure from the classic comic books. Even then, I was a comic snob, as we've established. And now, of course, these costumes have become iconic in their own right, and I absolutely love them. They just fill me with nostalgia. And that's something that I find useful to ask myself now with new comic book movies that come out. I might not like it now, but am I going to feel nostalgic about Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania in 20 years? I mean, maybe not. That's a bad example, but... Of course, 2002's Spider-Man went on to spawn 2 sequels. Spider-Man 2 is still acclaimed to this day as one of the greatest comic book movies of all time. But by the time that film had come out, I'd seen everything I needed to see. My lifelong Spider fandom was solidified. And I didn't know it then, but the wheels of my future YouTube career were already in motion. I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think there was ever a better time to be a Spider-Man fan. Hey, thanks for watching this video. This turn-of-the-century millennial Marveldom is my bread and butter. And speaking of Marvel and bread and butter, I recently made a video all about Marvel's failed restaurant of the late 1990s. It's a tale of bankruptcy, insane decor, and mutant chicken wings. So to find out all about that, click the video on screen now, and I will see you over there.